And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, your host, and joining me in the studio for a return, must be the third time now, Jim Feast, poet, writer, world traveler, bon vivant, man about town, and our guest joining us for the first time, poet and writer Carol Wierzbicki. Wierzbicki. I'm sorry, Carol Wierzbicki. And we're going to discuss their writings, their poetry and writings concerning the what we all in the New York listening range of this program in Manhattan, we all know all too well the effects of AIDS and how AIDS spread through our community and devastated it as a war would or as a bombing campaign might have. This was in many ways an epidemic in the 1980s, and so many talented, famous, wonderful people died way before their time. And it was a long time before, the government and the medical establishment even took notice of it and did anything about it, which tells you the danger of the recent Supreme Court decision allowing somebody to discriminate against a person whose rights should be protected under the law. So, in this atmosphere, I think it's important to revisit the 1980s and the period of AIDS in America. It's still out there, still infecting and killing thousands. The worst of it seems to be over, but that's only as good as the science. So to get into this issue and to focus on the life of at least one person who could have made all these contributions if it wasn't for this crazy disease. Let me hand it over. Jim, why don't you introduce a little bit what we're going to be talking about, who we're going to be talking about tonight.
Well, there's a person we knew, John Penn, who was Carol's boyfriend, and he died of AIDS, and I knew him well, and confluence of that, I wrote a novel, confluence of that, and a friend of yours, or someone you worked with, Gary Null, had done a book on AIDS, which I co-wrote, a long book where we discussed political aspects of the AIDS crisis, the fight for AIDS funding. So I set a novel, this one, Long Day Counting Tomorrow, recently out, which is it turns into a fictionalized story drawing on the experience with working with Null and researching the topic and talking to people in ACT UP and other organizations fighting for AIDS funding and fighting to get the government to deal with the disease, which was ignored, considered a gay disease, so it was ignored for years until Rock Hudson died, a friend of Reagan. That's when he suddenly realized there was a disease going on. So, but this deals with a character. It turns into a murder mystery in which the guy, and this part is invented, the guy is dying of AIDS and somebody tries to kill him. And he goes, why would somebody kill me? I'm dying anyway. So he says, let me try and figure out who's trying to kill me before I die. That's his. And as he gets involved in searching for his killer, he gets more involved in ACT UP and different groups. And so the book takes him through this growth of knowledge he grows more and more knowledge as he gets closer to dying, more about the community, learning things. He just being a sick person, he hadn't really followed up, and now he sees the whole political structure and how it's, it been
Can you show the cover? Show us the cover.
This
of
cover
the book.
is a gory-looking picture of a guy in a hospital. It's by artist Richard Leatham, whose son is quite a well-known novelist. And
so it's called Long Day.
Day Counting Tomorrow.
Counting Tomorrow. And when did you write this? What year was this?
This came out about 6 months ago.
Really? And what has it been a long time in coming, or?
Well,
you decided to do it?
To make it more complicated, this is volume 2 of a 3-volume work projected. Volume 1 came out 10 years ago, called Neophobe. Because in the background of Neophobe is about a literary group that begins doing various protest activities and getting involved. Political literary group.
Yeah.
This takes place 10 years. Takes place 2 years later with some of the same characters after the group is kind of broke up for various reasons.
I see.
But many of them got involved in helping this guy. He believes his murder is connected to this bizarre AIDS hospice where the doctor in charge, Dr. Vesuvius, believes that people don't have enough of this special chemical in their blood that makes them work hard. That's why they are dying of AIDS.
You were hanging around with Gary Null, right?
Well, yes.
So what do you think of Gary Null's position that, what is Gary Null's position on HIV and AIDS?
No, but this is...
What is yours? Let me ask you that.
Let me put it, this book which he wrote, was not very well acclaimed. I haven't worked with him for years, but the book itself, I know that it was just a questioning. But people attacked him, AIDS denialist, this and that. Whereas the book itself, which is a long and I think intelligent book, is about different explanations of AIDS crisis. Because there's people like Peter Duesberg, a prominent. He just says there's AIDS, it exists, but it's not caused by HIV. Now, and he's attacked and pilloried. I mean, why can't you have an opinion like that? I mean, it doesn't make him. He doesn't say AIDS shouldn't be treated. He doesn't say but Null himself just says, here's an opinion. I think the guy has something to say. Listen to him. Null does not say, I believe Duesberg and things like that. But he's attacked. At least in the book, he doesn't say it. Now, what he says on the air, I don't know.
No, he's never. He says pretty much what you just said. He presents other ideas and says they should be listened to.
But I'm saying I've read, like in Salon, they had reviews of the books which attacked him as saying things that are not said in the book. So I don't get that. So sadly enough, but this book is just talking about new wild treatments.
Where can people get a hold of that book?
It's on Amazon. It's on AK Press Distributor. AK Press
Jim
Distributor.
Feast, right?
Yes. Jim Feast. Here I am.
Right.
Like a dinner. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sounds like a fascinating book. How about is it just something that's in the cloud, or is it something you can get are there any stores in the New York, Manhattan area?
I hope so, but I really haven't checked out enough.
Maybe some alternative places, East Village Books, or some one of those great places. We don't know yet.
Who knows?
Strand.
I'm very overly like all of us, like yourself, over busy to really check things out. I'm sure it's there.
You just hope that it's doing right.
Yes.
Good. And it's on the internet though. Amazon.
Yes. Amazon. AK Press distributes it. It's from Autona Media, an anarchist.
All right, that's a publisher. Describe Autona Media.
No, myself and another character, Ron Combe, have a kind of an imprint there. Which Carol's book just came out on that. We try to do books of. Here's Carol's book.
Right, and that's a good transition. And Carol, welcome. And so, what is your contribution? It was this is a story about your ex-husband or your boyfriend?
My boyfriend. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit.
Talking about Jim's book.
Yeah.
He interviewed me extensively about John's life and what it was like dealing with somebody and being a caregiver to somebody who had actually a dual diagnosis. He had AIDS, and then later on, when he was on the AZT cocktail, he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So that.
Do you think that was related to the AZT? Or?
I don't know. It was kind of at midpoint of these treatments, and he died in 1999. And I think it was several years after that they started developing new treatments that actually prolong life. So his life was prolonged for about a year and a half after he was diagnosed, because by the time he got to a doctor, he had full-blown AIDS.
I see.
And it was most likely from a blood transfusion at a hospital. And we were not together at that time, so it was hard to know exactly what happened. But he believed that it was from a blood transfusion.
Right.
So he passed away in 1999, and that was kind of a crash course for me in caregiving and being a patient advocate. So he went to GMHC and got on emergency disability because he was just a part-time teacher. He didn't have insurance, really. So they helped him quite a bit.
Okay.
And this was, in the late 1990s.
So there was self-help. You couldn't depend on the government or the government programs. You had to depend on friends.
He was on SSI, I believe. That was another thing he was able to get for himself. He also suffered from bipolar disorder. So he had a really tough life. And after a certain point, he went back to school, and he was really trying to put his life together, and was taking antidepressants regularly, and he became a teacher, and he taught ESL, English as a Second Language.
Oh, sure.
And some creative writing here and there. So he was really, trying to put his life back together, and then this comes,
Of course.
So he just was dealt a bad deck in life. So that's what that was like for me. And posthumously, I ended up getting his novel published, which he kept himself alive long enough to finish. This was an autobiographical novel called Fear of Milk. Unfortunately, it is out of print. This was published through a company which I think is still in existence called Publish America. It's kind of like self-publishing, but you actually don't pay anything, and you have to, your manuscript has to be accepted.
Oh, that's nice.
So I did a little bit of editing on this and submitted it, and it was accepted. So.
And when was this published?
This was published in 1999.
Oh. And so Fear of Milk and...
2004, I'm sorry.
Okay.
This was published in 2004.
Right. So
Publish
what is...
America.
You played a role in pulling this all together after his death, his passing out, and creating it.
Another thing I did as a caregiver was, during that time, several friends and I were all going through some aspect of chronic illness, either as a caregiver or as a patient. And one of my friends, who was also a writer, was diagnosed with MS. Another one of our friends in our circle of writers had a mother in the hospital, an aging parent. Another writer had written several pieces about PTSD. He had been in Vietnam. So we decided we were tired of getting rejected by publishers and tired of being sick. So we got together an anthology called Stories from the Infirmary, and put together an anthology of different writings on our perspectives of chronic illness, either as a caregiver or as a patient. And there was poetry in there, and some short stories, essay, and so we got this self-published. My friend and the one with MS and I and John pooled our money together. John wrote 6 stories about 6 of his chemo treatments, kind of humorous stories, and we got it self-published. And after John died, I took the anthology around to hospitals and had readings to audiences of doctors and nurses about patient empathy.
I see.
And I really wanted to take that further, but I only ended up going to about 3 hospitals.
Well, you were going to treat us to an excerpt, right, as well?
Yes, this is from John's autobiographical novel, Fear of Milk, which basically chronicles his odyssey dealing with mental illness and being in and out of Bellevue and homeless shelters, and finally finding a place of his own. So this excerpt is where he first gets the results of his AIDS test. I took the test. Katie also went and got tested one day later. We both got our results on the same day. She had private insurance, which sped the whole thing up for her. I went into the doctor's office. A woman I hadn't seen before sat next to him. "Hi," I said as confidently as I could. "Everything okay?" I looked at the doctor's face, trying to get a reading. His smile was the same. Sit down. This is Mary Babcock. She's a social worker." He pointed to the woman. I shook her hand. Her hand was firm. Her eyes were a placid brown, and her dark hair flowed around her neck. She seemed younger than me. I tried to read her face, but she wasn't giving anything away either, her skin taut around a professional smile. "She's here because it's required by the hospital. We give counseling with every result," he said. His tie that day was a print of a surreal painting by Salvador Dali of 2 nude ghosts dancing. "It's sort of like a Happy Meal then, huh?" I said. They gave each other puzzled looks. "Like you get a prize with each meal," I further explained. They laughed nervously at my joke. "Sit down and we'll get right to it." "Okay," I said, sitting in the plastic chair facing them. Their chairs were both higher than mine. I had to look up at them. "So give me the news, and I'll be on my way." "Well, there is no other way to say this," said the doctor. He stopped, and they both looked at each other. I sensed pity from the social worker, not a good sign. I felt my stomach drop. "You're positive." "Oh," I thought back to the stomach bleed, to the staples. I wanted to start my life over again, starting with that football game with Marshall. "How do you feel about this?" asked Mrs. Babcock in a sickly, concerned voice. I closed my eyes. I didn't know what to say. "Tired," I finally replied. She went on to tell me that AIDS was no longer a death sentence like a few years ago. that there were these new drug cocktails that had worked for over 90% of those infected with HIV. "Have you heard about Magic Johnson?" asked Ms. Babcock. "Yes, who hasn't?" I answered. I could no longer feel my feet. "His HIV level is undetectable now, so there is hope." I nodded my head, thinking, I'm not a famous basketball player. "We need to get some more blood tests today. I'll be giving you some medication to start off with right away. We'll know more in a few days," said the doctor. "Okay," I said, my stomach somehow disappearing. "Expect that your life will be turned upside down, but that doesn't mean it will end," said Ms. Babcock. "If you want to set up some counseling..." I cut her off with a curt no. My life had already been upside down for so long. I had gotten used to it. "Okay, but if you change your mind..." Walking home down 14th Street, images of the Micah shelter of Jim, Jerome, and Lewis flashed in my head. Lewis had come back to the shelter right before I had left. Jim and Jerome had seen him first. They had congregated around him like he was a movie star. "So, you beat it?" asked Jim. "Yeah, so far, like I said." That's when he noticed me. He gave me a wink. "Never give in, never get out. That's my motto." Jerome slapped him on the back. "Way to go," said Jerome. I went up and shook Lewis's hand. "Welcome back," was all I said. I wasn't able to say goodbye before I left. He was out looking at his new apartment. Now I wished I had said more. On the corner of Fifth Avenue, music drifted from the Smile Grocery and Deli. It was an Elton John song, "Daniel, My Brother." Tears welled up, and I couldn't stop crying until I reached 4th Street. I went home and called Katie at work. I was lucky. Diana was nowhere in sight. First, I resisted calling, thinking that it wasn't right that I tell her at work. It would mess up her day, but I had to tell her. She would want to know. My tears had all but dried up. I had become good at limiting my pain. "I got my results," I said matter-of-factly. "Me too," she replied. "Good," I said. "You first." I had my fingers crossed as I pleaded in my head, "Please be negative, please be negative." "No, you first." "Come on, tell me. I didn't have time for such childish games." "Well, okay, if you're going to be like that, I'm negative." "Great," I shouted. I wanted to come through the phone and hug her. Then came the pause I had dreaded. She realized what my answer was going to be. "My news isn't that great." I stopped. I felt my tears coming back. "Don't worry, Rich. We'll work things out. I'll be home around 5. We'll talk then. Don't do anything stupid, okay? Don't be a jerk. Everything will work out," she said. I thought I had heard her voice crack. That's what the doctor said. He said the medication works for over 90. See, it's not like it once was. Hang in there. I'll be home soon. "Love you," I said. "Same here," she said, then hung up. I listened to the dial tone. It sounded like an ocean, and I could have sworn the air smelled of salt.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Heavy. Great. And there's no way, you could hear this on our program, and that's about it. There's no place to get this book.
You could probably find a few used copies floating around Amazon.
Great, great. John Penn, Fear of Milk, and someone you were very close to and helped bring this book about even after he had passed away in 1999, right?
Right.
I see. And that's amazing. So what, this summer, it's, we're coming up to Pride Month. I don't know if June is Pride Month, right? Yeah, so we're in Pride Month now, so it's a good time to think about these. But, the AIDS hit the gay community hard, very hard, but also many others were struck down by it for getting a blood transfusion, might have been one way, or for intravenous drug use. There was other ways, right? Interesting. And do you plan on developing this story? I mean, as far as, getting it republished, or is this just something you brought to us?
Don't know how I would do this, but I think it would make a great film. It's told in a very straightforward way, and the main character is very relatable. I think it would make a really good story. There was a similar movie that came out last year. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about the romance between two young people who were both diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I can't remember who was the star.
Trouble in Our Stars? The Trouble with the
No,
Stars?
it wasn't The Fault in Our Stars, because
Okay.
that was about cancer patients. But I think his story would have the same appeal. It's kind of about two things at once. It's about his struggle with mental illness and trying to get the correct diagnosis and get on the right drug regimen for that. And then later on, it's also about his battle with AIDS, which was a much shorter battle, but very intense.
Right. He wasn't in that 90%. He was in the 10%. Right. If that number was even accurate. All right. Great. So Jim Feast, thank you for another great program you helped me set up here. But you have your own book, and I heard you were going to read something.
Yeah. Let me read a little from. In this book, the character is. He's trying to set up. He's trying to reconcile with his family. The character named Raskin, and his sister comes to visit him, who they've been estranged, but they can't seem to get together. Then they decide to take the bus up to New Paltz or something. So they began to take. They get on the bus. Something weird thing that happened to me actually too in estrangement, where the bus was overloaded. So they put me on with a friend, and there's like nobody else on the bus but two of us.
The second bus,
the Greyhound bus. Yeah.
Right,
so So to read one little section here where they get first to get on the bus. All the mayhem he had caused by forgetting to purchase his ticket in advance boomeranged to their advantage. With no explanation, a conductor loaded them, all five of them, unceremoniously on another bus, and they took off. Jessie, his sister, wondered why they had been given this transport all to themselves. Perhaps Ras guessed since they were on a local, the bus would pick up a lot of people down the line. Enjoy it while you can, he told Jessie, leading the way to the long rear seat. As soon as they were properly underway, having flowed through the Lincoln Tunnel with its waspish yellow lighting and breasted the hump that led onto the raised highways of Jersey, Jessie revealed a shoulder holster under her suit jacket and pulled out a silver flask. Cheers, she slugged it. You ready to let your hair down? He gulped. First, let's call Mama. He gulped again. Hey, she reached over. Don't drink the whole bottle, Tiny. An old affectionate name. He handed the flask back. Just what the doctor didn't order. He felt a warm glow passing through his light head. She grinned. Kicks like a mule, don't it? Yeah, Jessie. Now, how about we just settle back a little, taste this fine hooch, and chill. Then we'll get to talking once we're down the road a piece. A long speech, but effective. She nodded agreement. They shared tugs and looked out the window as the bus began licking along the back roads, exiting the bulge of northeastern New Jersey and re-entering New York State. The night was peppered with snow, not so much winding down from the skies as spun in ground whirls by intermittent wind. These whirlpools gained a ghostly presence as they colored by the light from the neon advertising strips that decorated the side of the bus. These signs, which were lipstick red, made it seem as they passed the snow-laden trees that they were witnessing some counter-natural forest fire that burned only the bottom of the forest. When Jessie was sufficiently juiced up, she started talking. Now he remembered why he stopped going to bars with her. You'd done everything you could to hurt our family honor. Are you serious? He almost laughed. Honor? Our family has always been done for. Our father, the wandering Hugh, was more like a carrier pigeon than a nesting bird. Mother passed the time waiting for him by preparing endless roasts for the church suppers. Well, you're always taking whacks at things. If they're up in my fucking face. You're always taking whacks at Mom. If you paid more attention to her religion, you may not have screwed up. None of that started at home. You waited till you graduated from a good school, copped a nice job, had a fiancé to die for, and then you go nuts on us. You didn't have the guts to rebel when it might have meant something. Now, what are you on about? Rask asked. I only accepted things because you went along. I followed you into the mainstream, the prom, the dating boys, all that horse poop. If you hadn't stood up, if you haven't stood up, I might have resisted all that frilly nonsense. You can't have it both ways, Jessie. You can't castigate me for being a rebel and then up and wish I'd taught you how to be one yourself. It wasn't right. He ignored whatever she was thinking and said heatedly, I wasn't a heavy metal listening sissy who sings about angst without knowing fuck all about the world. I've seen everything society has to offer. Then I punked out. That's BS. Why? She settled back. If you weren't a poser, why did you always latch onto the latest fads? When crack was big, you smoked it. When AIDS was in the news, you hopped on that. He vented. You're a fucking lame brain. Do you know that? What do you think a fucking trend is? Educate me. Everybody's doing something, so it must be a trend. So how can you blame me for doing what everybody else is doing? She turned her head. Just tell me one thing. Okay. How could you try to commit suicide? Don't you realize how embarrassing that would be for me.
Great. So tell us the name of your book. Show everybody.
Long Day, Counting Tomorrow.
Right, and it just came out like a short time ago, right? And
yeah, it came out a few months ago, and
you can get it on Amazon.
Get on Amazon.
Right.
Me and Carol belong to a literary group for so there's kind of the characters in the book called Unbearables. We've been together for 20.
I was going to say deplorables. No, Unbearables. Right, great. The Unbearables, right?
25 years we've been together. We had a club. The two of us ran in the No Bar years ago. Remember the No Bar?
Sure, the No Bar, right. So what are the Unbearables? What is that all about?
Well, Carol can probably explain better.
They're a loose-knit group of irreverent poets and writers who send up institutions like the beatniks and just kind of thumb our noses at literary elitism. To give you an example, one of our band, Sparrow, we had a protest outside the New Yorker offices back in 1990 something, when their offices were over near the CUNY Grad Center on 42nd Street, across from Bryant Park, and we were protesting to get them to accept Sparrow's poetry for publication. And he actually went upstairs and met with Alice Quinn, the poetry editor at the time, and I think they went to lunch. And they did end up publishing some of his. Sparrow writes extremely short, haiku-like poems, but they're really funny. And they actually did end up publishing one or two of his poems in the New Yorker, but not where they normally put the poetry. It was like sort of buried in the talk of the town.
Oh, okay. So why did they? What do they have? An insider group of people they just go to all the time, or is there just a higher echelon of poets?
Go to Yale and Harvard, you get in there. But we did a book called Sparrow organized a book where we did translations from the New Yorker, where we took a New Yorker poem, then we translated it into like the kind of the way we would write it.
Right. So there's like straight corporate poetry as well as alternative, unbearable poetry.
Well, yes, I think there's It's
very interesting. All right, 20 seconds to go. Last words. Carol.
My poetry book, which just came out, is called Welcome Distractions. This is a shameless plug. Also by Autona Media, and you can also find it on Amazon. It's mostly humorous poems about the absurdities of everyday life. Welcome Distractions, accessible poems for time-strapped humans.
Thank you very much for joining us.